Cartels, gangs, street violence, and insanely high murder rates are problems that quite a few countries around the world are forced to struggle with. Leaders over recent history have tried all kinds of methods and tactics to deal with these problems, but the stories tend to go down a similar path with predictable outcomes. The core of the problem is never addressed, corruption runs unchecked, what seems like an initial series of wins slowly fades into hopelessness, and the misery of everyday people continues to linger on. In the last few years, one man in a small Central American nation has shown that there could be a way to quickly solve these societal problems. He's had his critics, people opposing him, and a lot of the international media calling him a dictator or a criminal. But he may have just provided a blueprint for solving these seemingly unsolvable problems that so many countries are faced with. With his country going from being the murder epicenter of the world to having the lowest murder rate in the Western Hemisphere, this is the story of how one man has seemed to solve one of the world's most brutal gang problems. El Salvador's president, Nayib Bukele, is one of the leaders with the highest approval ratings in recent history, and it's no wonder why that's the case. The country had the highest murder rate per capita in the entire world in 2015, only 20 years on from a brutal civil war that lasted for over a decade. Their political system was dominated by veterans from that conflict, who operated with unchecked corruption and had brought the country to a state of siege on the streets, where gangs ran districts as parallel states to the government, as the de facto rulers of the territories they held. This all started to change rapidly in 2019 as Nayib Bukele won the presidential elections, taking office at 37 years old to become the America's first ever millennial president, and the country hasn't looked back since. Human rights groups around the world have called him out for his country's treatment of prisoners, where more than 70,000 people have been arrested since he took charge. As part of that process, he was instrumental in opening up the largest prison complex in the Western Hemisphere, where a 40,000 person capacity terrorism containment center was built in 6 months to deal with the massive swathes of people being locked up. Other critics still refer to him as a dictator, where he changed the country's constitution to allow himself to run for a second term in office after the party he established only a few years ago now holds power in the Legislative Assembly, the Supreme Court, and the Executive Office. Despite what his critics, often international actors with no insight into Salvadoran history and current affairs, have to say, within his 5 years in office so far, he's taken a country that was known for gangs, crime, and a lack of security to be the country with the lowest homicide rate in the Americas, an apparent testing ground for the use of Bitcoin as legal tender, and was re-elected into office in a landslide victory with more than 84% of voters taking his side. To actually understand the story of how this relatively unknown young guy became quite possibly one of the most impactful leaders in Latin America this century, let's zoom out to look at how the country he stepped into the leadership role of in 2019 actually came to be. When Bukele speaks about El Salvador in the past, there's a reason he describes it as a poor country that has lacked in everything since it was established. When the Spanish began colonizing the Americas, they would organize their territories into viceroyalties. They had the Viceroyalty of New Spain, Peru, New Granada, and Rio de la Plata. The Viceroyalty of New Spain was made up of what is today Mexico, along with large parts of the southern and western US, as well as dependencies across Central America and the Caribbean. Central America rebelled against the Spanish Empire following Napoleon's invasion of Iberia, and the region declared its independence in 1811. The rebellion was put down by Spanish forces, but in 1823, they succeeded in independence, creating the United Provinces of Central America in a union that was made up of today's Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, Costa Rica, and Nicaragua. Once the United Provinces were an independent country, there were several big disputes between liberals and conservatives, particularly about the role of the Catholic Church and the strength of the executive government. This led to several bouts of infighting in the newly established state throughout the 1830s. These states went on to break away from the Union one by one, and El Salvador was fully independent by 1841. In the half-century that followed, there were attempts to get the band back together, but there were still many differences between the views of the leaders, and keeping each country small and isolated was the policy adopted. El Salvador's economy was always largely dominated by agriculture, with a big shift towards coffee at the start of the 20th century, leading it to account for up to 90% of the country's export earnings. From the mid-19th to early 20th century, the country endured chronic political and economic instability, characterized by coups, revolts, and several authoritarian leaders. This all culminated in the Salvadoran Civil War, which went on from 1979 to 1992, where the military-led government, backed by the US, was up against a coalition of left-wing guerrilla groups funded by the Soviet Union and its proxies. The war completely destroyed the country's social fabric. Over 1 million Salvadorans left, which represented a fifth of the population at the time, and the scars of the war continue to be present in everyday people's lives. Once the fighting stopped in 1992, the political scene was divided between two parties that were formed off the back of the two sides of the Civil War, with Arena representing the right and the FMLN representing the left, with mostly figures from the Civil War taking up spots in government. They had initial success in improving the living conditions in the country, but both sides of the aisle were known for their corruption while running on tickets of cleaning up the other party's corruption. Just to give you a feel for this, the last 3 presidents to have been elected before Bukele, representing both sides of the aisle, are now either in jail or sanctioned by the US State Department on charges of money laundering and corruption. Aside from corrupt leaders, the other legacy of the Civil War is a much more brutal reality. The warring sides had laid down their arms, but the conflict never stopped. El Salvador, until recently, was most known around the world for their gangs, and more specifically, the brutality of these gangs. These gangs actually started in the US, specifically in Greater Los Angeles, where multiple Salvadoran families had emigrated to. Gangs started growing in numbers and gaining an identity there, and once Bill Clinton decided to start deporting them back to El Salvador once the Civil War was over, they brought their gang structures home. Once they came back, they took shape as the MS-13 and grew into an international criminal organization with bases around the world, with some saying that the gang even started partaking in satanic rituals as part of their identity. The government had tried their hand at repressing these and keeping them under control with no real long-term success. But one man who was climbing through the ranks was about to change the country's trajectory forever. Many big changes in history start with the little details that most people don't pay attention to. And that was very much the case when a young man in 2012 was elected as the mayor of a small town of 7,000 people called Nuevo Cuscatlán. Nayib Bukele started his career in 1999 working for his father's advertising company. He went on to start an advertising company of his own, and both of these would go on to work on political advertising campaigns, specifically with the FMLN. When he became the mayor of this small town, he was a relatively unknown 31-year-old working within the FMLN party, but his exploits would go on to gather national attention. As soon as he took office, he forfeited his salary so that the money could go into funding a scholarship program. The illiteracy rate in the city had been at around 15%, so he launched a city-wide reading program, and by the end of 2015, the city had become basically free of illiteracy, becoming the 3rd town in the department to reach the mark and going well ahead of the national average. He used his social media platforms in ways that politicians around the world have hardly even considered. He posted his speeches on YouTube, he engaged directly with people on live streams on platforms like Twitter and Facebook, and from the start of his journey in politics, he's generally been very savvy with how he's been able to put his message across. Bukele built up an image of himself as a man for the people, posting videos of him inaugurating new things in town, celebrating their accomplishments, and answering questions by opening a line of communication directly with the population. He built a library, a medical center, and an infrastructure program in the city. The things he was doing were positive, and as a marketing executive, he knew exactly what he was doing with the branding, building a light blue N next to the developments he was making, which would go on to become the city's de facto logo and hold direct positive associations with the changes he was enacting. In 2015, he had his first step up, as he went on to become the mayor of the capital city of San Salvador. In the capital, he also built a new library, invested in infrastructure, reinvigorated their shopping markets, and signed off on some vanity projects that ensured that his image grew alongside the city's. It was during his time as the mayor of San Salvador that the country reached its historic low. The uneasy truce that was in place between the government and the gangs had collapsed, and homicides skyrocketed as a result. It got to a point in 2015 where they were seeing an average of 18 homicides a day, with a homicide rate of 103 per 100,000 inhabitants, which made it the highest in the world at the time. The government was starting to set a precedent for heavy-handed action, putting multiple people behind bars, with the incarceration rate rising to become the third highest in the world, even at the time before Bukele took office. Gangs unceremoniously killed members of the public as the government incarcerated people indiscriminately. It was in that context that the run-up to the 2019 presidential elections took shape. Politics in El Salvador had been run as a two-party system for the majority of the past decades. Either it was the FMLN or it was Arena in control of the state. Despite his surging popularity, because of consistent disagreements with the FMLN party he was associated with as mayor, Bukele was failing to get the votes of his own party members for some of his ambitions. Eventually, he gave them an excuse to get rid of him, and he left after years of clashing with the party hierarchy. He didn't have the time before the election to set up his own party for the presidential campaign, so he aligned himself with a smaller party for a long-shot run at the presidency. Bukele's main message was that the system and the establishment itself were the problems, as he promised to rid it of its corruption, refusing to turn up to presidential debates, focusing instead on getting his message across, mostly through his own Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube platforms. On the 3rd of February 2019, he won the election with 53% of the vote, beating both established parties, and with that, the Bukele presidency of El Salvador was underway. Even while Bukele was holding rallies in the run-up to his election, it was clear that what he was bringing to the table was completely new. He looked more like a Silicon Valley CEO pitching his vision than your typical politician running for an election. We'll go into some of the specifics of what he's done, how things were executed, some of the criticisms he's faced, and ultimately the trajectory he's put his country on. But before that, it's important to paint a picture of the multiple challenges he faced as he took office. Although the homicide rate had gone down from its 2015 peak, the number of homicides was still extremely high. People had lived in a state that had multiple parallel states within them, controlled by gangs who ruled through fear. The country had gone from being in civil war to being under the constant threat of gang violence in the streets, and most significantly, all of the options they had for presidents up to this point represented a slightly different variation of the same system that they had lived under for decades. Nayib Bukele's election was a watershed moment because he showed up as a guy who spoke against the very establishment that the majority of the population had grown to resent, and who seemed to have a plan to not only fix their most glaring issues, but also completely transform the country's trajectory. One of the first things he did was to unveil his territorial control plan, which was set to turn El Salvador from one of the most dangerous countries in the world to somewhere where people could actually go outside and live their lives without fearing for their safety. His plan had 6 stages to go through, with each one building incrementally on top of the other and leading to a completely changed society as a result of them. He started out by sending the police and military to 12 of the country's most dangerous communities, which were effectively gang-held territories, along with declaring a state of emergency in the country's prisons, which stopped prisoners from communicating with the outside world. One of his early goals was also to create opportunity, where he used a $91 million loan from the Central American Bank for Economic Integration to invest in community centers, skate parks, schools, and other services that would stop young people from joining gangs in the first place. The implementation of his plans didn't go unchallenged though, and eventually, signs of resistance from the establishment started to show. His aim was to modernize the armed forces to help them fight what had essentially become a war against the gangs. The problem was that to approve the spending, the bill had to go through the Legislative Assembly, which had been voted in 2 years prior and was stuffed primarily with members of the two opposition parties, which Bukele had humiliated and called out during his presidential campaign. He navigated through that by calling for an emergency session to convene the Legislative Assembly, as well as calling on an article in the Constitution that stated that people had the right to mount an insurrection if lawmakers didn't follow the Constitution. The result was a weekend emergency session of the Assembly where the police were present and swathes of his supporters were outside to put pressure on them and show whose side they were on. This brought criticism from some people around the world, but it was done in early 2020, and soon after, the pandemic started taking shape and it took over people's attentions around the world. El Salvador imposed a heavy lockdown on its population, enforced by the army and the police, and Bukele was able to make the absolute most of the circumstances in the world at the time. In 2021, there were elections for a new legislative assembly, and the new party that he set up, Nuevas Ideas, translating to New Ideas, won 56 out of the 84 available seats. With control over the Legislative Assembly, he was now able to more seamlessly pass his ideas as law, with none of them getting more international attention than his decision to make Bitcoin legal tender in September 2021. El Salvador became the first country in the world to accept Bitcoin nationally, even if it's not legally enforced. Some places, like the now famous Bitcoin Beach, widely accept it as currency, whereas most other places, like the capital city, have more limited acceptance rates, with only around 20% of businesses accepting Bitcoin. President Bukele has invested almost $100 million of his country's money on Bitcoin over the last years, which brought him a lot of recognition. It's brought foreign investments to the country directly from people holding cryptocurrencies, and in the year following the decision to accept it as legal tender, tourism in El Salvador increased by 30%, even as tourism numbers were down across the world after the pandemic. The reason Bukele saw El Salvador as a great place to introduce Bitcoin was because of remittances. Many Salvadorians live abroad and send money home to their families. This figure was said to have been at around $7.1 billion in 2021, which made up around 25% of their total GDP. By using Bitcoin to do this in the long run, there was a hope that they could reduce the fees that are paid to the companies that facilitate the transactions and leave more money in the hands of the people to spend. There are a few questions over the long-term viability of this project, and I'll leave a few videos linked in the description of people going much deeper into El Salvador's Bitcoin adoption, highlighting the pros and cons for you to check out after you're done with this video. The actual adoption of a cryptocurrency as legal tender in a nation is a case study in and of itself, but more than anything, it can be seen as one step towards a wider mission that Bukele has set out to achieve for El Salvador. The country, once plagued by civil war, gang violence, emigration out of desperation, and a lack of hope for the future, was now in the middle of a transformation. Bitcoin enthusiasts with podcasts flew in to interview Bukele on his vision, and he laid it all out, clearly gathering people's support for it. As with any good story of struggle to achieve a victory though, the path was far from linear and simplistic, and the popularity that he holds within the country today could be said to stem from how he dealt with one of the country's darkest chapters in recent times. The weekend from the 25th to the 27th of March 2022 was a watershed moment for the country with Bukele at the helm. The gang's unspoken deal with the government for special treatment in jail in exchange for relative peace in the streets had been broken, and the COVID measures had been eased, so the gangs went on an offensive, killing at least 87 seemingly random people. Bukele was said to have been absolutely furious about how years of slow and steady progress, showing signs of success, had suddenly been reversed over the course of a few days. And this was the turning point when he went all out to address the country's gang problem once and for all. The government approved a 30-day state of exception, suspending constitutional rights and going hard after anyone associated with the gangs. This paved the way for an all-out assault on them. Tattoos were enough to get you thrown in jail. arrest quotas were apparently established, and the policy became arrest first and question later. Bukele's carefully constructed plan with different phases and sequences had been thrown into disarray, and as he's gone on to say in interviews since, it was at that point that they decided to go all in and implement everything they had intended to do all at once. The state of exception kept getting renewed for months, and the incarceration rates mounted. 1 year on, 70,000 people have been detained, with almost 2% of the country's adult population behind bars in overcrowded prisons, waiting to make their way through an overburdened judicial system. To deal with one of the world's highest incarceration rates, a brand new prison named the Terrorism Confinement Center was unveiled in early 2023, being introduced to the nation in a very well-produced video tour with Bukele on his own YouTube channel. The prison is capable of holding some 40,000 inmates, making it one of the largest in the world. Even then, you'll still find images of overcrowded cells filled with gang members and suspected associates. As much as Bukele has received criticism for his treatment of inmates, the scale of the changing situation in the country is drastic. In March 2022, which included the infamous weekend we mentioned, El Salvador averaged 4.8 homicides a day. In April, the month that marked the start of the roundup, that number dropped down to 1.3. May saw the figure hit 0.5, and since April 2022, not a single month thereafter has averaged more than 1 homicide a day. Some question the validity of the data, given how it's been provided by the government itself, who has taken drastic actions to lead to these results. But what is undeniable is that El Salvador is now at least as safe as it has been in decades. People can walk the streets freely, and Bukele's popularity continues to grow, having an approval rating from his citizens of around 90% for the whole of 2023. His domestic approval hasn't been universally adopted abroad though, and as we'll soon see, he's had his fair share of critics who questioned him, his intentions, and what he's currently doing with the country. When El Salvador's constitution was established in the 1980s, there was an article clearly stating that anyone who had been in office for more than the previous 6 months, or any longer than 6 months at any point, couldn't run again. Since Bukele's party had taken over the Legislative Assembly, had purged the Supreme Court of people who opposed him, and had the control of the presidency, they were able to make the amendments to the Constitution and allow him to run for a second stint in office. No legal justification was given at the time. They just went with the logic that denying him the opportunity to run for the second term would be denying the will of the people. Some people protested, and the international news publications obviously focused on those images. But he won with more than 84% of the total votes in an election with a higher total voter turnout than was the case in 2019. Internationally, he's been condemned by pretty much anyone you would expect to be condemning. From Al Jazeera to The Economist, and from the Human Rights Watch to the US State Department, whether for his treatment of prisoners in mass incarcerations or from his re-election after serving for a single term, he's been labeled everything from a criminal to a dictator for his efforts. The most interesting part about that isn't even that they were condemning the president of El Salvador, but rather that El Salvador was in the news at all. Throughout their civil war, and even during the times with extreme levels of violence they faced, the country was rarely ever on international news until they started on a path that was truly newsworthy. Most of these publications, and the Western world as a whole, likes to think that they know what's best for a country like El Salvador, or even to make blanket statements that dictators are all bad and inherently evil, without actually looking at what his presidency looks like, what he's been able to achieve, or the trajectory that he's been able to put his country on. They see a change to the constitution which allowed him to run for a second election cycle, which is the norm in most Western countries, and assume that he is a threat to democracy without considering where the country was and where he took them to in his first term in charge. The checks and balances that most governments have in place for power, with the presidency, the Supreme Court, and the Legislative Assembly being separate bodies, are there to stop unwanted situations and power grabs from people who don't serve the country's best interests. When these checks and balances are the root of the inability to stop an unwanted situation, as is objectively the case when you have the highest homicide rate in the world and a political establishment that is run by corrupt leaders from the country's civil war, then it provides a case to really consider why they're there and who they're actually serving. Bukele has always been very clear in interviews and keynotes to point out how he followed the constitution on every step of the way, and even explaining how he was able to change it through the powers that the president was already granted by it. He was initially elected on a ticket of finally ridding the country of its issues with rampant institutional corruption and to make it a safer place. 5 years down the line, regardless of what one thinks of the methods he adopted to achieve that, it's no question that he's taken his country in a better direction. El Salvador today is almost unrecognizable to where it was when Bukele took over. When asked how he did it, he's able to point to a few factors, and we can add a few more to really distill the takeaways from what is genuinely an excellent case study of 21st century nation building. His main priority was to establish peace and have rights and the rule of law respected, which he achieved by tackling the country's gang problem. He focused on building up infrastructure and improving people's daily lives, and the result of their general consensus towards that is reflected in the polls. He got the population on his side, called out the bad actors directly and unceremoniously, established control by improving his armed forces, and was indiscriminate in his approach to dealing with the country's gangs. Bukele's success in transforming El Salvador has led many leaders from around the world and especially from Latin American countries to come seek his counsel on how to solve their own domestic issues at home. He's addressed the people that condemn him for his processed results, highlighting how they prefer to speak about the criminals and how they're treated rather than the honest, hard-working, everyday person who is living in a state of fear and terror every day for decades. Mass incarceration campaigns were the only solution they found after the tragedy of that weekend in March 2022. It's a shame about the wrongfully imprisoned people who are trapped in the prison system with dangerous criminals, and it brings up a genuine question of whether the ends really justify the means. If you look at his approval ratings and the sheer proportion of his population that back him, coupled with the fact that foreigners and especially part of their diaspora who had fled the country are now moving back, it's hard to argue against the fact that the vast majority of the population are on his side. Bukele managed to fix a problem that a lot of the world struggles with, and, as he himself says, there are certain powers that be that don't want the example out there. He openly and eloquently speaks about global agendas, evil people out there pulling the strings behind the scenes, and the deep-rooted reasons and incentives for the world being the way it is. He's done massive spending on infrastructure, gambled big on Bitcoin, and revolutionized his country not just for those at home, but for its perception from people around the world. Yes, he changed the constitution to allow himself to run for a second term, as is the norm in most democracies in the West. Yes, he's incarcerated tens of thousands of people, some of whom are there wrongfully. What he also did was transform the murder capital of the world into the country with the lowest homicide rate in the Western Hemisphere in a single term in office. He made the country become international news through the adoption of Bitcoin. He built infrastructure projects that will continue to benefit the population for generations. He showed up as a charismatic young leader with new ideas to build up his country in a time where presidential candidates around the world seem to be getting progressively older, less inspiring, and more incompetent. He ultimately challenged an establishment that had been founded and governed by corrupt leaders who allowed the country to deteriorate for decades and won. The story of Nayib Bukele as president of El Salvador is far from finished, and it's exciting to project where he could take his country to by the end of his second term in office. Let's see what happens and where the currents of history take him. But if one thing is for sure, is that his first term is going to be used as an example for a new generation of policymakers and nation builders around the world. If you enjoyed this one, don't forget to leave it a like, leave a comment below to let me know what you think, and if you're into topics revolving around geopolitics, people, the world, and life lessons, don't forget to subscribe to this channel to keep up to date with all the videos we have coming your way. We're still just getting started and there's a whole lot more to come. I'll see you next time.